which is not only affecting the environment, but it's killing people as well, particularly in countries like Algeria. We've seen a high death toll there. And Antonio Guterres is just saying the era of global warming is over. He has said the era of global boiling has arrived, and it is absolutely time for action. More on this story coming up here on BBC News. Thanks for being with us.
Live from London, this is BBC News. The starkest warning yet on climate change. A new report says July will be the hottest month ever recorded, as the UN chief says the Earth is now in an era of global boiling.
In Europe, it's a cruel summer. For the entire planet, it is a disaster. And for scientists, it is unequivocal. Humans are to blame.
A top Ukrainian general says his forces are struggling to make progress against strong Russian defences in the counter-offensive. And tributes continue to pour in for the trailblazing singer Sinead O'Connor. Her former manager tells the BBC how she came to record her classic hit, Nothing Compares to You. Hello and welcome. I'm Matthew Amroliwala and welcome to Verified Live. 3 hours of breaking stories and checking out the truth behind them. Well, in the last few minutes, the UN Secretary-General has given a searing assessment of the dangers of climate change. Antonio Guterres said the Earth is now in an era of global boiling. It comes as two major organisations monitoring climate change have warned that July 2023 is virtually certain to become the hottest month in history. The data from the Copernicus Climate Service and the World Meteorological Service predicts this year will be the planet's hottest yet. Well, around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Now, the general in charge of Ukraine's counter-offensive against Russia in the south has told the BBC that his forces are struggling to overcome Russian defences and move forward quickly. General Alexander Taranovsky said Russia's multi-layered minefields and fortified defence lines were making it difficult for military equipment, including Western-supplied tanks and armoured vehicles, to advance. Ukraine's counter-offensive is now into its second month, but progress has been slow. Areas shown here in the red are those currently under Russian military control. They include the cities of Donetsk and Mariupol. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale is in Dnipro and sent this report. Andrew Harding there in Johannesburg. Before we take a break, let me take you back to our main news, because in the last hour we've been listening to Antonio Guterres talking about these events, the heatwave right across Europe, the blazes, but more broadly about climate change. He was saying that we've now moved from the era of global warming to global boiling, as he put it. He said leaders, especially of the G20, must step up now for climate action and actually make decisions. He said there needs to be no more sabotage of net zero targets. He said the promises made must be kept to developing nations, and he said the evidence is everywhere. Humanity had unleashed destruction, but he said it was not too late to take the action that was required. So more on that story, more on our headlines here in just a moment or two.
People are travelling again, heading back out on the road and rediscovering their wanderlust.
Exploring new destinations and cultures, making fresh friends and creating memories that will last a lifetime.
That's why at the Travel Show, we're expanding our horizons too. And wherever we go,
we want you to come with us. Now that might make for an awful lot of excess baggage, but we think you're worth it.
The Travel Show, Saturday at 2:30 on BBC News and iPlayer.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here this half hour. The starkest warning yet on climate change. July is virtually certain to be the world's hottest month on record, as the UN chief says the era of global boiling has arrived. The British man who served 17 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit speaks to the BBC.
Obviously, there's been a hell of a lot to process mentally, and obviously there's a lot of joy in the result. It's the result I've waited for 20 years, but
The High Court in London rules the government's housing of unaccompanied child asylum seekers in hotels is unlawful. Tributes continue for the trailblazing singer Sinead O'Connor. Her former manager tells the BBC how she came to record her classic hit, Nothing Compares to You. Well, we'll have all those stories here in a moment or two, but we're heading to the BBC Sports Centre first, round up the sport of the day, and that's with Sarah Mulcairn. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Let's start then at the Women's World Cup, because there has been a big upset for the co-hosts Australia. Despite being ranked 10th in the world, they lost 3-2 to Nigeria, who are 30 places. And that, Matthew, is all your sport for me for the moment.
Sarah, thanks very much. Well, let's stay with sport, stay with one of those stories that Sarah was just telling us. The Liverpool captain, Jordan Henderson, signing for a Saudi club, the latest of those big headline players heading to Saudi Arabia. Let's talk now to Neil Atkinson, host of the Liverpool Fan podcast, the Anfield Wrap. Welcome here to the programme. So here it is, another big star name heading to Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's an end of an era. He won the Premier League, he won the European Cup. How do you see a move like this? Jonathan Blake there at Westminster, thanks a lot for that. Thank you. Well, around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK. For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
You're live with BBC News. Now, police say the death of Sinead O'Connor is not being treated as suspicious following the discovery of her body on Wednesday. The singer, an activist, died at the age of 56 at her home in London. Police said she was found unresponsive and pronounced dead at the scene, and that her family had been notified. She was best known, of course, for her 1990 hit, Nothing Compares to You. Hugh, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us live there from Dublin. We're getting to the end of this particular hour and back with more of our day's headlines just in a moment or two. Don't go away.
Okay. Pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Even though he was home alone, he rushed to the bunker, and she said that's what saved him. And children here have had to really think about these things.
Questions have been asked about why it's taken time for the UK COVID public inquiry to get underway. Sweden's, for example, was concluded last year.
President Zelensky is the centre of attention here, and that sends a pretty blunt message to Moscow.
More than just the headlines. The BBC News Channel. Watch on iPlayer.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Scientists warn July is virtually certain to be the world's warmest month on record, as the UN chief says the era of global boiling has now arrived.
In Europe, it's a cruel summer. For the entire planet, it is a disaster. And for scientists, it is unequivocal. Humans are to blame.
A top Ukrainian general says his forces are struggling to make progress in the counter-offensive against strong Russian defences. And tributes continue for the trailblazing singer Sinead O'Connor. Police say they're not treating her death as suspicious. Hello and welcome. I'm Matthew Amroliwala and welcome to Verified Live. 3 hours of breaking stories and checking out the truth behind them. Well, we start with a searing assessment of the dangers of climate change from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He said the Earth is in an era now of global boiling. It comes as two major organisations monitoring climate change have warned that July 2023 is virtually certain to become the hottest month in history. The data from the Copernicus Climate Service and the World Meteorological Service predicts this year will be the planet's hottest ever. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Now, the general in charge of Ukraine's counter-offensive against Russia in the south has told the BBC that his forces are struggling to overcome Russian defences and move forward quickly. The general said Russia's multi-layered minefields and fortified defence lines were making it difficult for military equipment, including Western-supplied tanks and armoured vehicles, to advance. Straight to breaking news. It is coming to us from Washington. The Reuters news agency is reporting that Donald Trump's attorneys have been told to expect an indictment against the former US president in the investigation of efforts to overturn that 2020 presidential election defeat. Two American networks reporting that that is, of course, highly anticipated, this move, but we are being told that Donald Trump's attorneys have been told to expect an indictment against the former US president. We'll get the latest from our correspondent in Washington here in the next little while. Don't go away, we'll have more in just a moment. Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines this half hour. The UN says July is on course to be the world's hottest on record. The organisation's chief says the era of global boiling has now arrived. The High Court in London rules the government's housing of unaccompanied child asylum seekers in hotels is unlawful. Tributes continue for the trailblazing singer Sinead O'Connor. Police say they're not treating her death as suspicious. And archaeologists have solved the decades-long mystery over the gender of an Iron Age warrior who lived on the Isles of Scilly. Well, we'll have more on all of those stories here in a moment. Let's round up all the business news of the day. Tig is here with us. Tig, over to you. I think it is interest rates you're leading on, is it?
It sure is, Matthew. The cost of borrowing is on the rise again. The European Central Bank has hiked its interest rate back to its record high, hot on the heels of a similar announcement by the US Federal Reserve yesterday. Well, the ECB's decision to raise its benchmark rate by 0.25 percentage point to 3.75% matches a peak which it last reached back in 2001. In other business today, the chief executive of Coutts Bank, which exclusively serves wealthy people in the UK, is stepping down with immediate effect. Peter Flavel's departure follows a scandal around the bank's decision to close the account of the prominent Brexit campaigner Nigel Farage because of his political views. The controversy has also forced the resignation of Dame Alison Rose, who was chief executive of Coutts' parent bank, NatWest. Ukraine has cut its key lending rate for the first time since the Russian invasion. The country's central bank said that the move is in order to support economic recovery, and it's hoping that the economy will grow by 2.9% this year. Although business activity has been restrained by constant missile attacks and the blockade of Ukrainian ports, the bank said that its reserves had reached an all-time high. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK. For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
You're live with BBC News. Let's turn to a really fascinating story now, because a decades-long mystery over whether an Iron Age warrior who lived on the Isles of Scilly was a man or a woman has now been solved, apparently. Archaeologists have been baffled about the identity of the prehistoric skeleton since it was discovered back in 1999. This particular move, the Special Counsel making this move, but we are keeping an eye on that with those reports that Donald Trump's attorneys have been told to expect an indictment against the former president in the investigation of efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election defeat. So those are just some of the lines coming into us from Washington. You're watching BBC News. Well, let's stay with the US, because we've been seeing the heat waves right around the world. We were also listening in the last little while to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talking about an era of, instead of global warming, global boiling. And we are expecting in the next little while to hear comments from Joe Biden. So let's head to the White House. John Donaldson is there for us. John, just take us through, what are we anticipating to hear from the president, given everything that is actually currently going on? An amazing story. We'll have more tributes to Sinead O'Connor on our programme in the next hour. We're also live in Ukraine. We're live too in Moscow, and we're waiting for those comments on climate change from Joe Biden. So all of that coming up. It's going to be a busy hour coming up, but that's after weather, and that's with Ben Rich. Live from London, this is BBC News. The world is in a new era of global boiling. The UN's dire new warning about record-breaking temperatures and the dangers of climate change.
In Europe, it's a cruel summer. For the entire planet, it is a disaster. And for scientists, it is unequivocal. Humans are to blame.
Donald Trump's lawyers are told to expect an indictment over efforts to overturn his election defeat in 2020, according to reports in the US. A top Ukrainian general says his forces are struggling to make progress against strong Russian defences. We talk live to our defence correspondent in Ukraine.
It's been 7 hours and 15 days.
And tributes continue for the trailblazing singer Sinead O'Connor. Police say they're not treating her death as suspicious. Hello and welcome. I'm Matthew Amroliwala, and welcome to Verified Live. 3 hours of breaking stories and checking out the truth behind them. Well, we start with a dire warning about the dangers of global climate change from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The Earth, he said, is now in an era of global boiling. Speaking in New York, Mr. Guterres pleaded for immediate radical action on global emissions, and he described the current intense heat in parts of the Northern Hemisphere as terrifying. It comes as the UN said this month is now virtually certain to be the world's hottest on record. Well, around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Well, you're live with BBC News. Now, the general in charge of Ukraine's counter-offensive against Russia in the south has told the BBC that his forces are struggling to overcome Russian defences and move forward quickly. The general said Russia's multi-layered minefields and fortified defensive lines were making it difficult for military equipment, including Western-supplied tanks and armoured vehicles, to advance. Well, let's go live now to our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale, who's in Dnipro for us. And Jonathan, it was fascinating listening to that interview that you did, watching your report, a really honest account from that general about just how tough this counter-offensive is.
That was a moment or 5 minutes that will live with me forever, irrespective of the subsequent kind of worldwide success of the song.
What an amazing story. Just one of the many, many tributes we've heard in the last 24 hours. I'm back with headlines here in a moment or two. Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines this half hour. A BBC investigation has found Google's earthquake warning system failed to get to many Turkish residents before February's deadly tremor. The army in Niger has said it supports members of the Presidential Guard who've carried out a coup. The High Court in London rules the government's housing of unaccompanied child asylum seekers in hotels is unlawful. And male or female, archaeologists solve the mystery over the gender of an Iron Age warrior on the Isles of Scilly. First though, let's head to the BBC Sports Centre, round up the day's sport, and that's with Mark Edwards. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Matthew. We're going to start with the Ashes, where England's cricketers have lived up to their big hitting reputation on the opening day of the fifth and final test against Australia at the Oval, but their tactics haven't completely. And that's all your sport for now. Back to you, Matthew.
Mark, thanks a lot. Thank you. Now, a BBC Newsnight investigation has found Google's earthquake warning system failed to reach many Turkish residents before February's deadly tremors. Google says its Android earthquake alert system gives users up to a minute of notice on their phones before an earthquake hits. But the BBC visited 3 cities in the earthquake zone, speaking to hundreds of people, and didn't find anyone who said they received a warning. The BBC's North America technology reporter James Clayton has the story. Great stuff with Colin Patterson. The desk is clear, which means I'm done. Thanks so much for watching. See you at the same time tomorrow. Next up, it's time for the 6 o'clock news. Bye-bye.
Hello. If you spent your day under cloudy skies, I'm sure you'll have noticed the